All right, so today we're going deep on something I think we all care about,
Yeah.
which is happiness,
hmm
well-being, feeling good about life, all of that.
Absolutely.
Subjective well-being, as the researchers call it.
Right.
And we have a really, really cool resource for this one.
We do.
We have a review that looks at 3 decades worth of research on this topic.
Wow.
So it's not just one study.
Right.
It's taking all of these studies,
Yeah.
putting them together and seeing what the overall picture is.
Exactly. It's like a meta-analysis
Yeah.
of, the field of subjective well-being. So it's pretty comprehensive.
Pretty comprehensive.
Yeah.
So what we want to do today is really give you like the core findings of this massive amount of research.
Yeah.
So you can walk away and be like, oh, okay,
Right.
I kind of get what contributes to
Good life.
a good life. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're not going to get bogged down in the details of
No.
every single study.
Not at all.
But we want to give you like the big picture.
Exact. The big pic.
Okay, so maybe a good place to start is like,
Yeah.
what do researchers even mean
Right.
by subjective well-being? Like how do they define it?
Yeah. So that's actually one of the interesting things about this review is the definition
Okay.
has stayed pretty consistent over the past 30 years.
Oh, wow.
Which is unusual in research. I mean, usually definitions evolve and change, but
Right.
the core of it has stayed the same.
Mm.
And basically it's how people experience and evaluate their lives.
Okay.
So it's got two main components.
Okay.
One is like the emotional side,
Oh.
so are you feeling, happy, content,
Mm-hmm.
joyful, excited, all of that.
Yeah.
But it also includes the not so pleasant emotions like
Wow.
sadness, anger,
Mm-hmm.
frustration, those kinds of things.
Yeah, it's like the full
A
spectrum.
full spectrum, exactly. And they actually call that affect.
Perfect.
Pleasant affect and unpleasant affect.
Okay.
And then the other side of it is more cognitive.
Okay.
So it's when you step back and you think about your life, like how satisfied are you
Okay.
with your life overall?
Interesting.
So it's like this blend of, feeling good in the moment, but
Yeah.
also feeling good about
Like the big picture.
the big picture. Exactly. Yeah.
So early on, was there a sense that it was more just about like being happy all the time?
Yeah. There's definitely this idea of, the happy person.
Right.
Like, is there such a thing as like a perpetually happy person?
Right.
And I think the research has shown that it's much more nuanced than that. It's
Yeah.
not about
Not about like this blissful state 24/7.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then just to add one other thing, they're measuring this mostly by self-report.
Okay.
So they're asking people,
Got it.
how do you feel about your life? How satisfied are you?
So we're not like hooking people up to machines.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
No. But, there are researchers who are trying to find more objective measures.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But for the most part,
Okay.
it's been self-report.
Okay, cool. So now that we kind of have a definition
Mm-hmm.
of what this thing even is,
Yeah.
I guess the question is, where does it come from? Like,
Yeah.
what have researchers found over these last 3 decades
Yeah.
about what contributes
Well-
to our happiness?
So there are a number of theories,
Uh-huh.
and one of the earliest ones that I think is really influential
Yeah.
is this idea of a happiness set point.
At the set point.
Yeah, so the idea is that each of us has kind of a baseline level of happiness that we tend to return to.
Okay.
And you can think of it almost like a thermostat setting.
Oh,
So, big events in our lives might kind of bump us up or down
mhm.
temporarily.
So like winning the lottery or something terrible happening.
Yeah, or, job loss, a
Yeah.
relationship ending.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is that over time, we tend to kind of go back to that
To that baseline.
baseline. Yeah.
I see. So it's like almost like we have this internal thermostat that's set at a certain level.
And it kind of wants to stay there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a very interesting concept.
Yeah. And it's actually been pretty well supported
Wow. Okay.
by research.
So it's not just like a hunch. It's like
No, it's not just a hunch.
it's like actually been studied.
Yeah, there's data to back it up.
Wow. So that's kind of like a starting point.
Yeah.
And then building on that, there's the adaptation theory, right?
Right. So adaptation theory is basically saying we get used to things.
We get used to things.
We get used to things, both good and bad.
Okay.
So, like you were saying, winning the lottery, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
You'd be super happy, but
But eventually
was-
it would just become your new normal.
right, like, oh, I have all this money.
Yeah.
This is just life now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the same thing with negative events.
Yeah.
If you experience a loss,
Mm-hmm.
initially it's incredibly painful.
Yeah.
But over time,
Yeah.
we tend to adapt.
That's really interesting.
Okay, so we have these two like fundamental kind of theories
Yeah.
about like how our happiness levels work.
Right.
What else has come up?
So another kind of important distinction is
Do it.
this idea of bottom-up versus top-down
Okay.
approaches to well-being.
Bottom up, top down. Okay.
Yeah, so bottom-up basically says that
Okay.
our well-being is built up
Okay.
from all the different areas of our lives. So, our relationships,
Mhm.
our work, our
Mhm.
health,
Okay.
our hobbies, all of that.
So it's like all these little pieces.
Contributing to the whole.
Yeah. And if you have a lot of positive experiences in those areas, that's going to contribute to your overall
Happiness.
happiness. Yeah.
Okay, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then what is top-down?
So top down is kind of the opposite.
Okay.
It says that our personality,
Okay.
our kind of internal characteristics play a more dominant role.
Interesting.
So, if you're someone who's naturally optimistic.
Yeah. You're going to tend to see the world
Yeah.
in a more positive light.
Right.
And that's going to influence your well-being, even if things aren't perfect.
Regardless of what's happening.
Regardless of what's happening, exactly.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, if you're someone who's more prone to anxiety or worry,
Right.
that's going to kind of color your experience.
Yeah.
And potentially lower your well-being.
So it's almost like top down is like it starts from within.
Exactly.
And then like kind of filters out.
Yeah, it's like a lens
Yeah.
that you're seeing the world through.
I see. Okay, that's super interesting. And what has the research shown? Like
Yeah, so the interesting thing is...
which one is right?
Well, it turns out both are important.
Both are important.
Yeah, there's support for both perspectives.
Cool.
So it's probably a combination.
So it's not like an either or.
Right.
It's like it's both.
It's both, yeah.
Okay.
And, that makes sense intuitively, right?
It does.
It's not just what happens to us.
Right.
It's also how we interpret it.
Right. And how we react to it.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on before we move into some more specifics is this idea of goals.
Yeah.
Like, how do our goals play into this?
Yeah, goals are huge.
Okay.
I mean, the research shows a very strong link between making progress toward goals that we value and our subjective well-being.
Okay. So it's not just like having goals. It's like goals that actually matter to us.
Right. It has to be something that's meaningful to you.
Okay.
And it's not even just about achieving the goal.
Okay.
It's the process of striving
Interesting.
towards something.
So like that journey is part of it.
Yeah. That seems to contribute to our happiness.
And then I'm guessing what constitutes a meaningful goal
Totally.
varies from person to person.
Totally different for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for some people, it might be, career success.
Yeah.
For other people, it might be relationships. For other people, it might be, creative pursuits.
Right.
Or physical fitness. It's really individual.
Totally. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a lot of overarching theoretical frameworks here.
Yeah.
Let's get into some more specifics now.
Yeah.
Okay, what are some of the actual external factors that have been shown to have a big influence on our happiness?
So let's start with
Go ahead.
demographics.
Okay.
So things like age, gender, ethnicity, that kind of thing.
Okay, so what's the deal with demographics?
So this is kind of surprising,
Okay.
but the review suggests that those factors
Okay.
don't have as big of an impact as you might think.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, there might be some small differences in certain contexts, but overall, they're not like the strongest predictors.
So it's not just like if you're in this age group,
Right.
you're going to be happier.
Exactly. It's not that straightforward.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like even things like, as you get older,
Yeah.
potentially have more health challenges, you would think that would
Right. You would think so.
have a big impact.
Yeah.
But it doesn't.
Not as much as you might think.
Okay.
We'll talk about some age-related trends a little bit later. But just in terms of like these broad demographic categories, they're not the primary drivers of well-being.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not really about like who we are
Right.
in terms of those big categories,
Right.
but it's more about
It's more about other things.
other things. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to some of those other things.
Okay.
What about socioeconomic factors?
Right.
So I guess like the big one there is money.
Money. Yeah.
Income.
Everyone wants to know about money.
Yeah, everyone's always asking about that.
Yeah.
So what does the research say about money?
So it's definitely linked to well-being,
Uh.
especially at lower income levels.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
if you're struggling to make ends meet.
Yeah. You're worried about paying your bills?
Right.
That's going to have a negative impact on your well-being.
Yeah.
But once you reach a certain level of financial comfort,
Okay.
the impact of additional income
Diminishes.
diminishes. Yeah.
So there's like a tipping point
There seems to be a tipping point.
where money matters less.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
It's not about endless accumulation.
I mean, it's about having enough.
It's about having enough to feel secure.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's some interesting cultural differences there, too.
Oh, okay.
Like in some cultures, income seems to matter a little bit more
than others.
than others, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's money. And then what about other socioeconomic factors like education?
Right. So education is also linked to well-being.
Okay.
And it's probably because, higher levels of education tend to lead to
more opportunities.
More opportunities, yeah.
Better jobs.
Better jobs, and also maybe just a sense of accomplishment.
You know you've achieved something.
Right.
And you have more resources to cope with challenges.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then what about our jobs?
Yeah, so job satisfaction is a big one. And it's not just about the pay.
Okay.
It's about things like...
Like what?
Do you feel secure in your job?
Right.
Do you have some autonomy? Do you feel like your work has a sense of purpose?
Right.
Those kinds of things.
Yeah. Do you feel valued?
Do you feel valued? Exactly.
Yeah.
All of those things seem to be really important.
Yeah, because I can imagine if you are stuck in a job that you hate, that's going to have a big impact on you.
Huge impact, yeah.
But regardless of how much money you're making.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so we talked about money, education, jobs. What about relationships? Like, how do our connections with other people factor into all of this?
So this is one of the most consistent and robust findings in the entire field of well-being research.
Oh, yeah.
Social relationships are huge.
Huge. So like our friends, family, romantic partners.
Romantic partners, yeah. Having those close connections is incredibly important.
For our happiness.
For happiness, yeah.
Okay, and so is it more about like the quantity of relationships?
That's a good question.
Or the quality?
It seems like quality is particularly important.
Quality, okay.
So, having a few really close, meaningful relationships is probably better
than having a ton of
superficial ones.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but even just having a supportive network of people that you can rely on seems to make a big difference.
Interesting.
Yeah, and they found that, for example, married people tend to report higher levels of well-being
than unmarried people.
Right. Now, there's probably a lot of factors that go into that.
Right.
It's not just the marriage itself, but it does seem like that having that close partnership is beneficial.
Okay.
Yeah.
So social connections super important.
Absolutely.
Okay. What about health?
Right.
Physical health, mental health.
Yeah. Health is huge.
Okay.
I mean, good physical health and good mental health are very strongly associated with well-being.
Okay.
And it's interesting because how people perceive their health can actually be just as important as
like what's actually going on.
Yeah, as the objective medical indicators.
Wow.
So, if you feel healthy, even if you have some,
medical stuff going on,
minor medical issues, you're probably going to report higher well-being than someone who is objectively healthy but feels terrible.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's not just about like what your doctor says. It's about like how you feel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I'm guessing mental health is a huge piece of this.
Huge piece of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, conditions like depression and anxiety obviously can really lower your well-being.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not surprising that there's such a strong link between mental health and overall happiness.
It's all connected.
It's all connected. Yeah.
Okay. One other thing I wanted to touch on in terms of external factors is religion or spirituality.
Right.
Like, does that play a role?
Yeah. So there's been some research on this.
Okay.
And it seems like there is a modest positive relationship between religious involvement and well-being. Yeah, but it's not a huge effect.
Okay.
And it probably depends on the person and their cultural context. Some people find a lot of meaning and purpose and social support through their religious communities.
Yeah.
And that can definitely contribute to well-being.
Okay.
But it's not a universal thing.
Right. It's not like a guarantee.
No, definitely not.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I guess the last external factor that we should talk about is culture.
Culture.
Like the society we live in.
Yeah.
How does that influence our well-being?
Yeah, so culture is a big one.
Okay.
Because different cultures have different values.
Right.
Different norms, different ways of thinking about happiness.
Right. Like what even constitutes
a
good life might be different
Totally.
are different places.
Yeah. And, some cultures might emphasize individual achievement and happiness, while others might focus more on collective well-being or social harmony.
Right. So there's not like a one-size-fits-all definition of happiness.
Not at all.
Okay, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are some of the big external factors.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's shift gears and talk about what's going on inside.
The internal factors.
Yeah, the internal factors.
Yeah.
Because we talked about how, our personalities, our tendencies can play a role.
Huge role.
So what has the research shown about specific personality traits and how they relate to subjective well-being?
So a few traits really stand out.
Okay.
Extroversion.
Extroversion.
So people who are outgoing, sociable.
Okay.
They tend to experience more positive emotions.
Okay.
So they tend to be happier.
Okay, so that makes sense. Like if you enjoy being around people.
Right.
And you're energized by that.
Exactly.
Then, that would probably contribute to happiness.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, neuroticism.
Neuroticism.
So people who are more prone to anxiety.
Right.
Worry, negative emotions.
Yeah.
They tend to have lower well-being.
Okay, so that makes sense. Too.
Yeah.
And then is there anything else?
Yeah. Conscientiousness.
Conscientiousness?
Yeah. So people who are organized.
Okay.
Responsible.
Yeah.
Goal-oriented. They also tend to have higher well-being.
Really?
Yeah.
I would have thought that would have been more of a mixed bag.
You would think so, right?
Yeah, because like some people who are really conscientious might also be really stressed about everything being perfect.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it seems like overall, having that sense of order and purpose contributes to well-being.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are some of the big personality traits.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about adaptation.
Right.
Like how we get used to things.
Yeah.
What about our coping mechanisms?
Right.
Like how do those play into this?
Yeah. So our coping mechanisms can really influence how we respond.
To challenges.
To challenges, exactly.
Yeah.
And how resilient we are.
Okay.
So, if you have healthy coping mechanisms like, problem solving.
Yeah.
Seeking social support. Finding positive meaning even in difficult situations.
Right.
Those kinds of things can help you
bounce back from adversity.
And maintain your well-being.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not just about what happens to you.
Right.
It's about how you deal with it.
It's how you deal with it, exactly.
Okay, and then what about just like our thoughts and beliefs, like our cognitive processes?
Right, so cognitive factors are huge.
Okay.
Things like optimism.
Optimism.
Yeah, having a positive outlook on the future.
Okay.
That's a big one.
Okay.
Self-esteem.
Self-esteem.
Feeling good about yourself.
Yeah.
That's also really important.
Okay.
And then social comparison.
Social comparison.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how we compare ourselves to other people, that can have a big impact on our well-being.
So if you're constantly comparing yourself to people who are like doing better than you.
Yeah. That's going to make you feel bad.
Yeah.
But if you focus on people who are maybe less fortunate.
Right.
That can sometimes make you feel better.
Interesting.
So it's really about like where you're focusing your attention.
Exactly. And it's also about how we interpret events. Two people can experience the same situation and have totally different reactions to it.
Right.
Based on their, beliefs and their interpretations.
So it's like the story we tell ourselves.
Exactly. It's a story we tell ourselves.
About what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the last internal factor that we touched on earlier is genetics.
Genetics.
So is there a sense that some people are just born happier?
So the research does suggest that there is a heritable component to well-being.
So like our genes do play some role.
They do play some role.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's not the whole story.
Okay.
It's really important to emphasize that. Our environment, our experiences, our choices, all of those things also play a huge role.
So it's nature and nurture.
It's nature and nurture, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we're not just like slaves to our DNA.
No.
Okay, good.
No.
All right. So we've talked about all these different factors that contribute to well-being.
Yeah.
Now I'm curious, how does this all change over time?
Right.
Like as we go through life, does our happiness tend to increase, decrease, stay the same?
That's a good question.
What have they found?
So the findings on that are a little bit mixed.
Okay.
Some research suggests there's like a U-shaped curve.
A U-shape?
Yeah.
Okay.
So happiness is higher in young adulthood,
Okay.
Maybe dips a little bit in middle age and then goes back up in older age.
Interesting.
Yeah. But it's not like these are huge dramatic shifts.
Okay.
It's more like subtle trends.
Okay.
And overall well-being seems to be fairly stable.
Across the lifespan.
Across the lifespan, yeah.
Okay.
Once you reach adulthood.
Okay.
That's interesting.
And then what about adaptation? Like we talked about how we adapt to different life events.
Yeah.
Like how does that play out over the long term?
Yeah, so adaptation is really important here.
Okay.
Because, big events in our lives can definitely cause, big changes in our well-being.
Yeah.
But over time, we tend to adjust and go back to our baseline.
Your baseline, yeah.
Yeah, so, even after a major positive event, like getting married or getting a promotion, eventually that kind of initial euphoria wears off. And it just becomes part of your life.
It's the new normal.
It's the new normal, yeah.
Yeah.
And the same thing with negative events. After a divorce or job loss, it's incredibly painful.
Yeah.
But over time, most people are able to adapt and find a new equilibrium.
And find a way to be okay again.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, there are some events that are so traumatic or so chronic that they can have more lasting effects.
Yeah.
But the human capacity for adaptation is pretty amazing.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we wrap up,